Yes, indeed. Thank you, John. And we've spent a good part of the last week and a bit setting up displays and reorganizing
Mm.
stuff upstairs. Big shout out to Steve, our new worker, who's
Yes.
done a great job of getting everything
Mm.
laid out in time. And then yesterday we spent most of the day trying to start the catalogue and organize and
Yes.
stuff. But
Mm.
I'd set you one task over the last couple of weeks, which was,
Mm.
can you please correctly lay out our new Lucy skeletons?
Mhm.
Now, as you can see on the screen right now, we've actually got this layout of Lucy. Now, Lucy, of course, is
Mm.
Australopithecus afarensis. It's this
Mm.
skeleton, and it's quite a partial skeleton. But Diane,
Yes.
before we even start talking about the
Mm.
skeleton and some of its bits and display and stuff,
Yes.
we had a little bit of trouble trying to actually lay the skeleton out in a display form. Why was that?
Well, for a start, it's all in bits. So we got it in about 8 or 9 different plastic bags. They were labelled arm, ribs, vertebrae, etc. And so for reference, we thought, well, we'll look up how the skeleton has been set up in different museums. I had some photos I'd taken in the Natural History Museum in Britain. We found some on the internet from a French museum, and a couple of, and you'd taken photos in an American museum, and they weren't all exactly the same. And that makes the point. This was not dug up as an articulated skeleton, in other words, with all of the bones joined up together like they would be if you had dug up a buried body in a cemetery. It is all in pieces, and in fact, none of the bones are intact themselves. They're all in pieces as well. So it's quite a challenge to put one of these together in some sort of anatomical order. And in particular, we found the vertebrae, right, the spinal bones were not in the exact same order in all those museum displays that we looked for photos of. So we have put them together in what we think is appropriate and fits with the museum displays that we've taken photos of. The arms and legs, of course, are a bit easier because they're a bit larger, and we can see how they fit together.
And in fact, we actually had, so we went first of all to the great fount of knowledge that is Wikipedia, and had a look at their skeleton layout, and we ended up realizing that actually if we used that skeleton layout, then we had too many bits, and so we went to the Natural History Museum and the one in France, and there was still bits left over, and so I'd taken a photo from one in the Los Angeles Natural History Museum. But we actually have a book here, Diane, and this one seemed to be quite useful. This is a book called it's called The Dramatic Discovery of the Oldest Human Ancestor. It's actually written by the man who discovered it, Johansen, and it was written only about 4 years after he discovered it. So it's actually quite a nice early piece of work which describes Lucy and has details about what people thought about her. And in particular, you can see there we've actually got one nice layout of the skeleton, which we actually used. It matches quite nicely with the cast that we've got. Now, we've sent or will be sending 2 of these casts back to Australia with Diane for both John's museum and for Craig's museum as well. So if you're in Australia, you'll get a chance to go and see them one day. But Diane, perhaps if you could just give us a little bit of a rundown about how Lucy was found and a bit more information about things like her pelvis, her hip bone, and her skull and jawbone, and particularly in light with this lovely reconstructed skull that we have down here.
Yes, well, the Lucy skeleton was found in a place called Afar in Africa, in Ethiopia, and in fact that's where it gets its proper scientific name, Australopithecus afarensis. Now, Australo does not refer to Australia, the country, it just simply means southern. So the proper scientific name for this set of bones is Australopithecus, and that literally means southern ape. So Australopithecus, southern ape from Afar, afarensis. And that should remind us that this is not a human being. This is an ape. and that is acknowledged in the professional literature by the professional scientists who have looked at this. But if you go to the popular literature or to what's normally set out in popular TV programs, this skeleton is often referred to as a human relative or a relative of us. So somehow we have some sort of connection to this particular creature, and that is the exact opposite of what the Bible says. The Bible says there are human beings and there are animals, and something called Australopithecus or southern ape definitely belongs in the animal kind and has no connection with humankind. But of course, that is against the prevailing cultural belief that people evolved from apes, so we have to have some sort of connection, and Lucy is considered to be one of those connectors. So what we have here is a partial skeleton. It's not a whole skeleton, it's about 40% complete. Now, that is a lot for one of these so-called hominids. Sometimes they only consist of part of a skull or some limb bones or maybe a bit of both. This one has a lot of bones, and it's considered to be about the most complete of the hominids, the ones that are definitely not human but definitely not ape. So what we have is, if we start at the top, we have some fragmentary pieces here which have been identified as being part of a cranium or a skull cap. And so that's why we have this model here. And I say model because most of this is not what was originally found. Now, they have very carefully put in the bones that were originally found, and you can see them here. And so that one matches that piece there. This one sort of matches that piece there. And this one matches this other piece over here. But there's a bit on the back. But apart from that, there's very little of the face, maybe a little bit of the top of one of the eye sockets, and none of the upper jaw. Now that matters because we do have the lower jaw, and here it is here, and it is complete, it is intact. This has not been glued back together again. It is intact. So we can see the shape of the upper jaw, and if I put it back so that you can see the contrast behind see how it has a distinct V shape. Now that's distinctive of an ape's jaw. However, if we just upend this model, you can see that has a curved shape, right? This is a parabolic or a parabola shape, and that is a typical human upper jaw, which will match with a human lower jaw. But if we try and put these two together, we don't have a match, okay? This is a V shape. This is a U shape or a parabola shape. They are quite different. So what they have done here is a reconstruction, but it's not an accurate reconstruction using the actual evidence that was dug up. So they are trying to bend the truth here to make Lucy much more human than it actually is.
So you're saying, Diana, it's sometimes worth, therefore, going back to the original specimen, the original fossil, and actually asking what is actually found, or what has been found, what is actually represented here, and is it reasonable to ask questions about every single little detail with these bones?
Oh, it's always reasonable to ask questions, and so that's why it's important. That's one of the things we do at Creation Research. We keep a watching brief on the scientific news, and we try and go back to the original sources to discover what was actually found and what is the story they're telling about it. And this is a classic example. This is what was actually found, the V-shaped jaw. The U-shaped jaw is the story they're telling about it, and they don't match, and it's important for us to know that. And so what we do is we try and help people to sort those two things out, point out any mismatches, and also to help people understand things in the light of biblical truth, because that's what matters. We're not just here to stir up scientific controversies or anything like that. What we want people to understand is when you go back to the actual evidence, what was actually found, it often makes more sense if you look at it from a biblical point of view. And in fact, the actual evidence, God is the God of the real world. We can stand our ground, and the evidence does actually fit what the scriptures tell us, that people have always been people and apes have always been apes, and some apes, like this one, have died out. That does not mean they evolved into anything else. It just means they're dead. So Australopithecus afarensis is simply a dead ape.
So going back to this asking questions then about the fossils, a group of scientists started asking some questions about one of the vertebrae, and I think that really does highlight the point about how Lucy was found, as well as the fact that you can analyze these bones to death, and when you do, there's a few controversies that crop up. So give us the rundown of the vertebrae.
Yes, well, even the secular scientists are questioning this. These bones have been extensively studied, even down to the most minute detail. This is actually a 3D printed model made from scans, so it is very accurate. But a few years ago, someone was studying the vertebrae, and we did write about this in our newsletter, and thought that one of the vertebral fragments didn't look quite right, and it was this one here, for either an ape bone or a human bone. And so they decided they'd look into it with a little more detail and compare it to ape bones and human bones and some various other species of apes and monkeys. And they came to a conclusion that maybe it looks most like a baboon bone. And that's a reasonable suggestion, because there are baboons that live in that region, of course. And so just like there are dead apes, there could be dead baboons in there. And as one of the throwaway lines in their report, they said, well, it could have just been washed in with these other bones, which goes back to our original point. These are not dug up as sort of nice, neat, articulated skeletons. They are assembled from a whole lot of bones that might be sort of fairly close together, but they are not articulated. They are bone fragments, and they have to be put together. So even the secular scientists are questioning whether all of these bones do go together, and it's possible that that one doesn't.
All right, so and we were talking through this earlier because we've been filming about Lucy for a project, and you were talking about some of the vertebrae and some of the way that they'd been put together. So again, when you're comparing them amongst all of the different ways that the museums have reconstructed them,
yes,
they're a bit all over the place.
When we looked at the different museum displays, they weren't all exactly the same, and that points out the problem you have when you have a whole lot of fragments that aren't all linked up together. They can be reconstructed in different ways, and that can happen with any fossils, not just with these hominid fossils. It's happened with dinosaur fossils. It's happened with all sorts of fossils.
Yeah. Because let me just zoom out for a second and just talk about something else for a moment, Diane, because we made this point earlier when we spoke as we were filming around the museum, and I'm just going to move this back a bit so I can pull up another fossil. You see, coming from and John will be with us, from a fossily type background, right? We're often used to type specimens that are a little bit more like this. Okay. Now this is a cast again, but it's a cast of one of the large ichthyosaurs that Mary Anning found. The original is now in the Oxford Natural History Museum. This one is on display in our Creation Research Centre. But the great thing about a type specimen like this is that you're pretty much fully complete. Yeah. You're pretty much fully there. And so when you find random fragments, which is, let's face it, how you find most fossils, right? You are able to go back and actually compare them to the type specimen and go, well, this is a very distinctive vertebrae, a very distinctive rib bone, so you can tell whether you're dealing with something that's an ichthyosaur or the plesiosaur or the pliosaur. And a beautiful fossil like this is fantastic for that use. Now, this shouts for quick burial, fast burial, rapid fossilization. It's in rocks that you find these deep sea creatures buried next to the deep sea shells, buried next to trees, and buried next to land dinosaurs. So it's definitely a flood environment. So it's good evidence of a global flood, Noah's flood. But when it comes to our ape-like ancestors, or supposed ape-like ancestors, these human evolutionary fossils, we don't have anything like this.
No, we don't.
And the closest that we have to things like this, they are clearly human beings, like your Neanderthal skeletons and the like.
Oh yes, when you find a whole skeleton, they're very clearly ape or they're very clearly human, and no one disputes that.
And so it really does pay, you should pay attention to the fact that we don't find beautiful, lovely, complete skeletons like this, as the models in the museums would suggest. When you see your lovely reconstructed Lucy skeleton, or lovely reconstructed model of what they think Lucy might have looked like, right, walking on two legs and so on and so forth, we're actually dealing with something that is inherently very fragmentary, like we have down here on the table. Well, Diane, why don't you give us then a rundown through the hip bone and the pelvis bone, because this should get us on to another interesting point. Of course, you go to places like, they used to be, they've actually taken it down now, but it used to be, if you'd go to the Natural History Museum in London, you'd see this depiction of Lucy on two legs walking, sometimes holding a baby, eating stuff. They still have that as a depiction in the Houston Museum of Natural Science. I was there last year and saw it. So let's go on to the hip bone, because we need to talk about, was she a four-legged creature or was she a two-legged creature? And we also need to talk about some of the controversy that goes on around the hip bone. And to help us with this, you can see just standing behind you, we have Ezekiel. Ezekiel is our human skeleton here, and Ezekiel is a bipedal chap. He walks on two legs. So Diane, maybe you'd like to give us a bit of a rundown then about the pelvis, about the layout, about the bipedal versus quadrupedal question, and compare it to Ezekiel as well.
Yes, well, human beings are designed to be upright, which means our weight is balanced neatly around a line that goes right down the center, and it goes behind the cervical or neck vertebrae in front of the thoracic vertebrae. So you've got a sort of S-shaped curve here. And then the weight is distributed through the pelvis and finally into the femur or the thigh bone through this big robust ball and socket joint. Now it looks like it's coming apart here, but of course in real life that ball fits very, very deeply into this socket, so that's a good strong joint. And the hip bone here is attached to the base of the spine in a nice curve that comes around the front there, so that you've got the pelvis is like this. It's like a sort of, pelvis literally means basin, which is what it's shaped like. So you've got a nice curve around here, and the weight goes down through the ilium here, which is the hips that you refer to when you put your hands on your hips, that you can feel down into the, excuse me, down into the femur. Oh, excuse me. Now here we have the Lucy skeleton, and you can see it should fit there, not very well. These bones have been rather battered about a bit. I mean, that's how they were found. And you don't have that nice curve here, and you've also got this long straight bit between the ilium, the flare of the hip there, and this should come around there in a curve to meet the other bone in the middle. And this ball here fits into there, but you don't have that very, very deep socket. So this is actually much more like a chimpanzee's hip. And the original founders who found this admitted that Lucy's hip looked much more like a chimpanzee hip. But they got one of their colleagues to look at it, and he agreed, yes, it looks more like a chimpanzee's hip. But he said, perhaps it has been broken and then reassembled somehow. Perhaps something stood on it, and then it was distorted into a shape which made it look like a chimpanzee's hip, but it really should look like a human hip. And he actually got stuck into it with an angle grinder and remade it. And he admits that. In fact, we have the transcript of the PBS program that actually showed him doing it. Owen Lovejoy, so you can read about that. And I think the video of him doing that is somewhere on the internet.
Yes, it's become quite infamous.
I have actually seen that. So when this bone was originally found, those who looked at it acknowledged it looks more like a chimpanzee's hip or an ape hip. And this joint here is not as strong as it should be for a four-legged creature. The other thing to do with whether it walked on four legs or on two legs is to look at the body proportions, and the arms are much longer than the legs, even though we've only got, even though they're all broken. But you can work out how long they should be from the overall contours here. And everyone acknowledges that the body proportions for this creature are ape-like and the limb proportions are ape-like. Other studies have been done on what remains of the wrist of these, the ends of the two bones, forearm bones here. And they acknowledge that this was a tree-swinging, knuckle-walking, ape-like creature. So it has the body proportions of an ape, the limb proportions of an ape. It has the distinctive features that you would get of a tree-dwelling ape, curved finger bones, curved toe bones, and little facets on the wrist bone, which fit with a knuckle-walking ape. Now, by knuckle-walking, we mean when it walks on four limbs, it walks like this with the fingers curved underneath. And there was also an interesting study about how this creature may have died, which involved doing an X-ray scan so that you saw the internal features of the bones as well as just the external contours. And they found that there were signs of quite a lot of trauma, and in particular this bone here, which is the upper arm bone or the humerus. Now, normally that is a ball and socket joint. Here is the other side of it. You can see there's a nice smooth ball there. This one looks like it's been smashed to bits, and it has. This is the result of a typical sort of injury. If you fall on your outstretched arm, a common fracture that you get from that is where the ball joins onto the shaft of the humerus. That just gets smashed in, and that's what's happened here. And anyway, the overall pathological diagnosis was that this creature has had a serious fall from a great height. So basically, this is a tree-swinging ape who was up a big tree and fell out. And that's how it probably died. And we've written about that in our newsletter as well. So you can read about that on the fact file with all the details of the particular injuries.
Okay, so basically we've looked at Lucy's skull, we've looked at her vertebrae, we've looked at her pelvis, we've talked about whether she walked on two legs or fours, we've looked at her body proportions, we've looked at, well, in fact, this particular specimen of Lucy, the original Johansen specimen, that's not the only Australopithecine that's been found.
No, there are other Australopithecine specimens. It's just this is the most complete one. It has the most bones.
But we have found some others which have like more details of the fingers and the like, and the fingers clearly show curvature of the fingers. So we're dealing with something that swings from the tree, something that knuckle walked. And in fact, as you said, they've even done studies to the point of being able to look and see that this is a creature that died in the way that an ape would die, falling out of a tree, right?
Yes.
So everything about the skeleton that has been found, that has been studied, that's been practically analyzed to death, everything about it says this is an ape.
Yes.
Okay, so in that case, why is Lucy still heralded? I mean, we're sort of getting on for 40 years on, right, from the publication of this book, right, the oldest human ancestor. But we were talking earlier that even today, Lucy's not technically even still considered our direct ancestor anymore.
No, in the professional literature, it is never referred to as a human ancestor. But it's an idea that has become embedded in the culture, and the museums will put a human relative rather than an ancestor, but they want to make a link between this sort of creature and apes and people, because that is the prevailing cultural idea that people are derived from apes. So we're just overgrown apes that have evolved shorter arms and longer legs and stood upright. In fact, there is a famous documentary, The Ape That Stood Up, which is considered to be about human evolution. And so there is a gap there between apes and humans, because if you go to the zoo, you can tell the apes from the humans. Even preschool children can tell the apes from the human. There's an obvious gap between apes and people, and they have to fill that gap. And so when they have fragmentary things like this, where they can manipulate the idea, as it were, they use these to fill the gaps, to fill that gap. And in particular, they want to fill in the gap in terms of the time that human beings supposedly evolved between 1 and 2 million years ago, and apes have been around sort of, I don't know, 6 or 7 or whatever. But anyway, there is a gap there. And the radiometric and other dating that's been done on the place where these were found comes out about 3.5 million years, and that sort of fits into that gap.
Okay, so it sort of is quite convenient to use then this argument of being human ancestor, even though they're not technically regarded as a human ancestor per se. But then, I mean, you go back to sort of the, 40, 50 years ago, and you kind of had this nice thread of, oh, now we've got Lucy all the way through as a missing link to Neanderthal, which was considered a missing link at one point to human. And we'll talk a bit more about Neanderthals a little bit later. But we're now at a position, even in modern science, and Neanderthal is considered a human being.
Yes.
And Lucy isn't even considered an ancestor. And so why then do evolutionists still cling to this idea that there is good evidence for human evolution when we still don't have this nice, clear lineage? In fact, you went to the British Museum and to the Natural History Museum. I know you've been several times, but they have this lovely wall display with all of their skulls and everything on it. And there really isn't the evidence for evolution there at all.
No, there isn't. But they have to fill that gap because they do not want to believe in the scriptures, which tell us that human beings were made in the image of God as separate creations, not as some kind of animal derivative. It very clearly says that animals were all made after their kind, human beings after their kind as well, or mankind made specifically in the image of God. There was never any physical connection between human beings and apes, which are considered to be land animals, or they are land animals. They still are. Even the extinct ones were land animals. So there is a distinct gap there. It will always be there. And so it is important for us to consider what is man, or what are human beings, because they are not apes. They are separate creations. And John later on is going to expand on that.
Yeah, so just one more thing before we finish up on this bit and go back to the team and maybe take some questions. But just going back to where we started with Diane, with the skull up there. So even though the skull is, as you can see, very, very fragmentary, what can we tell from the fragments of the skull themselves regarding things like brain space of this creature?
Well, from this skull, you can't tell very much, but
No.
as we've said, there are other specimens of Australopithecines, so that if you put all of that evidence together, you end up with a brain size which is about the same as a modern day a chimpanzee or a gorilla. So it's about a third the size, a quarter to a third the size of a human brain. So it's a long, long way. Again, big gap.
So again, we're back to this. This is an ape type thing.
Yes.
So when we compare that to here's our human skull. Let me give you a few skulls here.
Oh yes, we have a few
We've
spare
got a
heads,
collection.
yes.
This isn't a brilliant cast, but it's an okay sort of representation of one of again those supposed hominids, ape-like ancestors. And I'll ask you about hominids and the meaning of hominid in a moment. But you see, there's three prevailing theories about the sort of the white skull that you've got in your right hand there. One of them is that they are a human ancestor. Another one is that they're actually an ape, like a relative to an ape or relative to a human. But one of the bigger theories, and let's say the better ones, is that it's actually an ancestor to a gorilla.
Yes, this one rejoices in the name of Sahelanthropus, which means an ape-like creature that was found in the Sahel, which is down near the Sahara Desert. So all of these are found in Africa. And as you can see, it's quite a different shape to this is a cast of a human skull, and quite different in both the shape of the face and the size of the brain case. So this one is definitely an ape, and there are various theories about it. One of it is that it is an ancestor to a gorilla, and that's probably a reasonable sort of assessment.
But then if we compare then to a human skull that you've got there as well, and at this point we'll bring in another skull, because we won't say too much about this skull because John's going to deal with it a little bit later potentially, but we've actually got now a Neanderthal skull in your right hand and a modern human skull in your left hand. And what are we dealing with things like the brain capacity compared to Lucy?
Well, this one, the Neanderthal, looks like it's had a long, hard life, and it probably has, but in terms of brain space, it has more than the modern human average. So this one has a bigger brain than the modern human average. So there is no doubt that Neanderthals were fully human, and we know that from their other bones as well as from their brain size. So that's 3 or 4 times what Lucy is. Lucy is definitely down in the chimpanzee level.
So let me take the Neanderthal back. We'll come back to Neanderthals later potentially, but let me ask you one more question, Diane, before we finish up, because terminology can often confuse people, okay? So we've spoken about, big long name, Australopithecus afarensis. We know that it means southern ape, but another term that often gets used, and it's used for Lucy, it's used sometimes for Neanderthal, it's even used for something that is most likely the ancestor of a gorilla. What is a hominid, and why is it so popular in evolutionary terminology?
Well, hominid means, man-like. So the scientific name for human beings, Homo sapiens. So homo means man, so hominid, man-like. And so that is used to describe things that they want people to think of as being something like human beings, but not fully human beings, because that fits in with the story of a progression from ape to man-like creatures to fully human.
So it's not even a fully scientific term in the sense of you can still have things that are clearly apes regarded as hominids. It's just really an evolutionary term that's
evolutionary descriptive term,
to try and anything that relatively potentially fits as being slightly man-like, that you try and fit into an evolutionary type.
Yes.